Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, the Ecological Landscape Alliance Executive Director, and I'll be the moderator for today's program, Landscaping for Plant Diversity. This is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series, a series that was developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education. And by collaborating on these webinars together, we expand the reach of our regional programs. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're largely nonprofit and volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, the Illinois Landscape Contractors Association, the Kansas City National Plant Initiative, and Rescape California. If you have a question for the presenter, you may ask at any time by typing in the question box, and we'll be addressing all the questions at the end of the presentation. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Randi Eckel. Dr. Eckel has been studying native plants for over 30 years and founded the mail-order native plant nursery, Toadshade Wildflower Farm, in 1996 to expand awareness of natives and to also expand their availability. A lifelong naturalist, lover of nature, and confirmed plant and ecology nerd, her word, not mine. She specializes in the interactions between plants and other living things and focuses on the complex issues facing native plants and native plant communities. Welcome, Dr. Eckel.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I like to embrace that nerd title. It makes my life so much easier to go forward that way. I'd like to welcome everybody to the presentation today, and I am very interested to know why my slide is not changing, but we will fix that very quickly. Have you changed the control over to me, Penny? There we go. There we go. So thanks very much, everyone, for coming. I'm going to be talking about diversity and habitat gardening. And this is really a passion of mine and has been for a very, very long time. This is the Coastal Maine Botanic Garden. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to go there. It's a fabulous location, and it really shows up some of the things that we can do when we look at the palette of native plants that are available to us. Look at all the plants that are in use there in just a single one of their gardens. We have so many choices available to us. Native plants are adapted to grow and support wildlife in ways that introduced plants simply cannot be. And we have such diversity available that we have a plant for every place. We have plants that grow on mountaintops, mountaintop bulbs. We have plants that grow in dry fields and meadows. We have plants that grow along the seashore in very salty, harsh conditions. We have so many fascinating plants. And by introducing native plants into the landscape, you can also invite birds and butterflies and other creatures into the landscape as well. Because really what we're doing when we create a landscape is we're trying to recreate an ecosystem. So today, we're going to go over more or less 4 things. We're going to talk about the components of a successful habitat, the importance of native plant diversity in creating a functioning ecosystem, the importance of embracing insect diversity in landscapes, and how ecoregion can affect plant choice. This creature here is a hummingbird clearwing, the day-flying moth. If you're going to have this insect in your garden, it loves to nectar on wild bergamot, but you also need to have the host plants for its caterpillar, which are things like viburnums, native honeysuckles, and snowberries. So then what are the components of a successful habitat garden? Well, first we need plant diversity, not simply using the same species over and over again, but looking at the great diversity of species that are available to us and using as many of them as we can. We need native insect diversity. Things like this tiny plume moth on goat's beard, and butterflies and moths, and aphids and beetles and wasps, predators and parasites. And we need structural diversity. This is a fabulous illustration that I have borrowed from the municipal site of the city of Ryde, Australia. You'll notice that there's a few sort of Australian terms on there. Most folks in the United States don't refer to a rockery. But this, I think, is just a wonderful illustration. And it shows that you can create a diverse habitat garden or habitat landscape in a fairly small space. There's a lot of things going on here in this slide. You see there's understory ground covers. And then there's mid-story shrubs. There's canopy levels. There's layered vegetation with dense shrubs. There are places for butterflies to hide at night and moths to hide during the day. There are logs so that you can have some place for your salamanders to go and your native bees to live. And there's trees and shrubs so that our birds have cover as well when they're in the garden. They have some place to go. The plant choices that you make in a garden will drive the food choices, which will dictate who, if anyone, lives in your ecosystem or in your landscape. In the last slide, it showed that there was leaf duff. You notice they didn't mention mulch. We've become rather over-addicted to mulch in our modern landscapes. It's a tool. It's not a feature in its own right. It's really an indication of an immature garden in most cases. It's also a money pit. It causes a lot of money to be spent over and over again, not only to buy the mulch and apply the mulch, but then the current thinking goes that you have to then rake away all the old mulch once or sometimes twice a year and take it all to the curb and start all over again. It doesn't support the ecosystem. It is really entirely sterile. There are a few ants and a few insects that will live in it, but really not very much. It creates a maintenance cycle that actively removes faunal diversity from the garden. So instead of using miles and miles of mulch, we should look to using green mulches instead. That is ground covers. If you Google green mulch, I have to tell you, it will come up, it will show you mulch, wood chip mulch that has been dyed green. And that's not what I'm talking about, obviously. We have a lot of really great native landscapes, native ground covers that you can use in the landscape that will support the ecosystem, act as part of the ecosystem. We need to remember that lawns are about walking on, and we can put things in our lawn that will make them part of the ecosystem. The green lawn with nothing in it except for short cropped grass is really a desert. They're expensive to maintain, and they support no wildlife whatsoever. But if you add walkable native plants to the lawn, violets, moss phlox, starry cerastium, we can create our lawn spaces so that they are part of the ecosystem and support it. On the right here, there is a lawn at Longwood Gardens near Philadelphia, up near an area they call the Eye of Water, but up on one of the hillsides. Every year they have thousands and thousands of crocuses that come up, and folks flock to Longwood Gardens to ooh and ah over this fabulous view where you just have this lawn which has just been turned purple by crocuses. And yet then they go home, or we go home, and we look at the lawns and see we have violets blooming in our lawns, and everyone wants to go and get out the herbicide to kill the violets that are growing in the lawns. Why are flowers in the lawn considered a bad thing? They're great when they're at Longwood Gardens, but somehow not acceptable in our landscapes. One of the wonderful things about putting violets in particular, or allowing violets in your lawn, is it'll support this fabulous butterfly, the great spangled fritillary. Great spangled fritillaries are very large butterflies. They're about the size of a monarch. Unlike monarchs, however, female great spangled fritillaries are not very good mothers. They don't seek out their host plants to lay their eggs, but they simply scatter their eggs about, and sometimes they're near a host plant, but they really don't make a great deal of effort to make sure that that's true. The scattered distribution of violets, who, by the way, tend to shoot their seeds, which is why you have scattered distributions of violets, perfectly matches the egg laying of the great spangled fritillary. Her eggs will hatch in October and November, and the tiny caterpillar will have to wander off in search of a nearby violet. It'll overwinter the tiny caterpillar and complete its feeding in the spring, and then emerge the next year as a butterfly. But not if that egg is laid in the middle of a field or in the middle of a meadow that has no violets. If it's laid in the middle of a lawn that is simply grass, it doesn't stand a chance. Now, some folks, when you say violets, they only think of the common blue violet. It is the state flower of several different states, but we actually have lots and lots of different violets that are native in the US. There's about 30 of them that are native to the Northeast alone. So you don't need to use the common blue violet. You can use the evergreen striped cream violet. You can use Labrador violets with purplish leaves and thread-like root systems. You can use downy yellow violets, which are one of my favorites. We need to look at our ground covers differently. Beyond the violets, we have other things like plant and leaved pussy toes. It's an excellent, drought-tolerant, deer-resistant ground cover. Silvery gray. And in addition, having these adorable little flowers in the spring, from where it gets its name, it's also a host plant to the American painted lady. This is one of the caterpillars. The American painted ladies don't feed on very many plants. They like pussy toes. They like sweet everlasting and pearly everlasting. This caterpillar is feeding on sweet everlasting. Now, one of the problems that we have in trying to embrace insects in our gardens has to do with education, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we need to embrace caterpillars in our gardens. Well-meaning folks will go into their gardens and actively pluck the caterpillars off their flowering plants and put them out into the middle of their lawns. Most insects, not all, but many of them, are fairly host-specific. So by plucking them off their host plant, for example, plucking it off of this caterpillar off of pearly everlasting or pussy toes and putting it out in the middle of the lawn, all you've done is kill off the caterpillar. And then you won't get this beautiful butterfly. I include a picture of the pupa or chrysalis down in the lower corner as well, because a lot of people, oddly, are afraid of these structures. They don't know what they are, and we're afraid of what we don't know. A diversity of native plants supports a functioning ecosystem and a diversity of insects. So let's start looking at this. This is a plant that a lot of people probably know. This is blue false indigo. It was awarded the 2010 Plant of the Year by the Perennial Plant Association. It is one of the native plants that we use in our landscapes that is used over and over again. But quite frankly, even though we have thousands of plants at our disposal, we tend to use the same dozen or 2 dozen native plants in our landscapes. This creates a bit of an endless cycle. Because as landscapers, you go to the nurseries and you ask for the plants that you know that nursery is going to have in stock. But the nurseries are only growing the plants that they know you're going to ask for. So we wind up using the same plants over and over again, even though we have really a huge number of species at our disposal. So back to the blue false indigo here. Beautiful plant, drought tolerant, deer resistant, really terrific. It supports several different butterflies, most of which people have never heard of or never even given a thought to. So one of them is the orange sulfur, shown here. And up top there in the right-hand corner, that is a queen bumblebee. The queen bumblebees, when they come out in the spring, are very fond of feeding on blue false indigo. But in addition to blue false indigo, we also have the small yellow false indigo. Supports the same butterflies. This is a frosted elfin here in the picture. It's a more delicate plant. The color really pops. It still has sort of a blue-green foliage. It's a beautiful plant. Takes very dry conditions, or will tolerate very dry conditions. Carolina lupin, Thermopsis villosa, which is not actually a true lupin at all, also known as Aaron's rod, also supports the same butterflies. It's a very closely related to the Baptisias. And here's a picture of a hoary edge, which is one of the skippers it supports. But then who is this wild blue dusky wing that I keep talking about, the wild indigo dusky wing? Well, here she is. This is an adult female nectaring on Laetris. Obviously, this is rather later in the season because you can see those green seed pods to the left. Those are actually the seed pods of the Baptisia. One of the points that I want to make, and it surprises an awful lot of people, is to realize that caterpillar hosts and butterfly hosts are often not the same. So this skipper is feeding on a plant long after the host plant that its caterpillars feed on has finished blooming. We have hundreds of species of butterfly and thousands of species of moth. And most folks don't know many of them and don't really know how to support these different creatures because we don't tend to focus on them perhaps as much as we might. One of the concerns that people have in introducing native plants and encouraging butterflies and moths into their garden is they're afraid that their garden's going to get all chewed up and they're going to have just caterpillars all over the place. Caterpillars are rarely found in huge numbers. At least caterpillars of native insects are usually found in pretty moderate numbers. They tend to hide. Lower left-hand corner here, it's actually an empty pupal case of the wild indigo dusky wing. You see it completed its feeding and actually webbed together some leaves and hid. There's a reason for that, because most caterpillars never grow up to be butterflies or moths. Most caterpillars grow up to be baby birds. Doug Tallamy, in his book, Bringing Nature Home, really outlined in great detail the different kinds of caterpillars that different birds feed on. One of the things that he pointed out, which I think is an extraordinary detail, is that chickadees feed their young up to 600 caterpillars a day. That's a lot of caterpillars. Caterpillars of our native insects are not going to feed in huge groups and make themselves terribly apparent because they want to grow up to be butterflies and moths, not bird food. We must think beyond a few species of native plant and beyond one insect. There's been a lot of really important work done recently about the monarch to try to support the monarch butterfly. A lot of it focuses on planting milkweeds, and planting milkweeds is a great idea for monarchs, but they must nectar all season long. In the mid-Atlantic states, the monarchs start showing up in May, and they don't leave again until October. This monarch on goldenrod here is getting very important nourishment to make that long flight back down to Mexico. The milkweeds have long since finished blooming. I was in central New York 2 days ago, and the monarchs were all over the place, nectaring on goldenrods and on our native asters. We have tons of goldenrods that are available to us in the landscape. Most folks are afraid of them because for some strange reason they think that they're allergic to them. Goldenrods do not create hay fever in the fall. They have sticky pollen. They must be pollinated by insects that grab that sticky pollen and move it from plant to plant. Their pollen never blows on the wind. So we have all these great plants that are available to us to support wildlife through the fall. Seaside goldenrod is an incredibly tough plant. It has thick leaves. This is along the coast of Maine. It's very salt tolerant. We have reef goldenrod and zigzag goldenrod, both of which are woodland, very well behaved woodland goldenrods. And even roundleaf goldenrod, Solidago patula, which will grow in swamps. It will grow in standing water. It'll tolerate sand and it'll tolerate clay. And all these plants are really insect magnets. They're so important to support our wildlife in the fall and the diversity of insects. Here we have a bumblebee nectaring on a goldenrod. By embracing insect diversity in landscapes, you create a balance in the garden. Not only do we encourage pollinators into our garden, but we also support other creatures. In the lower left-hand corner, you'll see a 10-spotted lady beetle here on the goldenrod. They're very, very important predators of soft-bodied insects. But they also will feed on pollen. A lot of predators are perfectly happy taking a meal of pollen and sipping some nectar in between feeding on their prey. Wheelbugs, another important predator, sitting here lying in wait and feeding on a little pollen while it waits. A very large syrphid fly larvae, which are truly maggots because they're flies, are incredibly important predators, again, of soft-bodied insects. The problem is that we don't spend enough time outdoors as adults or as children, so we aren't comfortable with a lot of this wildlife. Folks are comfortable with pollinators, but they get very concerned about wasps in their garden. But wasps that are nectaring on plants or feeding on pollen are entirely benign. I walk through clouds and clouds of them every year, and they never bother me in the least. They're also extremely good predators. If you ever have the opportunity to watch a wasp, a paper wasp, go hunting in a garden and attack a caterpillar, it's really something to be seen. They attack it and nip off all the legs and parts that they're not interested in, and then just eat down on the green goo that's on the inside. Perhaps it's only those with a strong stomach, but it really is interesting to watch. And as we look at diversity in our gardens and diversity of insects in our gardens, we've gotten to a point in educating the public is that most of the public are happy to accept honeybees in their garden. But it's still a bit of a dicey thing, but they understand that honeybees are an important part of the environment. Well, in fact, honeybees are not native. Honeybees are by and large Italian. They're a Mediterranean insect. We have no native bees in the U.S. that can make honey like a honeybee, but we have hundreds and hundreds of species of native bee, which actually do most of the pollinating of our crops, and certainly most of the pollinating of our native plants. Some research in England has recently shown that the honeybees are actually creating problems for the native bee populations in England by outcompeting them in certain areas. But if we can just barely get folks to accept honeybees into their gardens, they don't even recognize these tiny things like this tiny native bee. I think it's a halictid on staghorn sumac flowers. They don't even recognize this as a pollinator or something that might pollinate the flowers in their garden, the flowers in their vegetable garden, or be important pollinators of crops at all. Then when you get to insects that look truly scary, people are very eager to, well, kill them, quite frankly. This is a fascinating insect. It's about, 2.5 inches, 3 inches long. It looks like a terrifyingly large wasp, and it is a large wasp, but it's a beneficial insect. It parasitizes white grubs in the soil, couldn't sting you if you wanted it to, and they entirely ignore people. I did quite a bit of photography of this particular insect and poked at it and moved it around some, and it ignored me entirely. It has no fear of us, it has no interest in us, and it can't hurt us. We need education so that folks understand that all of these insects are needed in the garden to create a balanced ecosystem. And again, we need to understand the caterpillars are useful in the garden. The idea that hundreds and thousands of caterpillars in our environment produce the beautiful butterflies and moths that we find so glorious, and also provide food to raise most of all the birds around us, this is lost on most people. This is the brown-hooded owlet, not a particularly flashy-looking moth, but certainly a very colorful caterpillar. So back to monarchs. There's been a lot of education about monarchs, and folks understand that monarchs need milkweed. Certainly in the mid-Atlantic, there are 3 milkweed plants that are most often referenced: common milkweed, swamp milkweed, and butterfly milkweed, the 3 across the bottom here. We forget the fact that we have other milkweeds at our disposal. We have world milkweed, which is a beautiful, very delicate plant. Creates a really fabulous effect in the garden. Poke milkweed that is adapted to woods edge habitats. And four-leaf milkweed, which is a wonderful and rare woodland species. But wait, that's not a monarch, is it? I get a lot of folks that are very, very interested in supporting the monarchs, but they don't even want to think about or know about or support some of the other milkweed specialists that are also in our midst. This is the milkweed leaf beetle. It's particularly fond of swamp milkweed, but it will lay its eggs and reproduce quite happily on any of our milkweeds. Unlike the monarch butterfly, it doesn't fly away during the winter. And this is an important point. One of the problems with monarchs as an educational tool is that they fly away every winter, which means we don't need to provide any habitat for them for the winter. But most of our insects, most of the creatures that live in our environs spend the winter with us. These milkweed leaf beetles overwinter as adults in the leaf duff underneath the plant. The red milkweed beetle, which is really incredibly clever. So the red milkweed beetle actually nips off the midvein of the leaf to slow down or stop the flow of the white latex before it feeds on the end of the leaves. It overwinters as larvae down in the root zone. And here's another butterfly that's feeding on common milkweed. This is a northern cloudy wing. Again, a little bit like the dusky wing I showed before. It's not the flashiest of butterflies, but I, for one, like all butterflies. There was a woman I was talking to several years ago, and I was showing her, I believe it was a metal mark butterfly. And she looked at it and she said, "Oh, it's not very pretty, is it?" And I simply hung my head. I didn't know what to say. I don't think I've ever seen an ugly butterfly. But these northern cloudy wings, their host plants for their larvae are Desmodium and Lespedeza and other legumes, but they overwinter, again, as larvae in the leaf duff at the bottom of the plant. And tiger milkweed, tiger moths, milkweed tiger moths, beautiful silky gray moths with a yellow body. They tend to feed in large armies of caterpillars because the caterpillars have the aphthematic coloration that keeps predators from feeding on them. And here it was feeding on the rare purple milkweed, Asclepias purpurascens. So we forget about the great diversity that's available to us, and we forget about the fact that all of our insects don't leave. It's a Baltimore checker spot. And we're going to talk about Baltimore checker spots now for several minutes. I'm going to use it as an illustration of several different points. First of all, it overwinters as third instar, partially grown caterpillars in nests in leaf litter and duff at the base of the plant. Much like queen bumblebees, yes, there's a bumblebee on the left here, the queen bumblebees also make leafy nests, ground nests. And remember that mulch I was talking about? Well, if we've got caterpillars and bumblebees that are overwintering in the leafy mulch at the bottom of our plants, and if every fall we cut away every stem and rake away every leaf and remove every bit of mulch and put it in bags and haul it away, we've taken all the insects, all the butterflies that we've just encouraged to come to our butterfly gardens, all the bumblebees that we hoped to provide nectar for, and we've just sent them all to the curb. We're actively removing the faunal diversity by removing all of that habitat every winter. But let's look again to the Baltimore checker spot and the white turtlehead, which is its host plant. Baltimore checker spot really, really prefers laying its eggs on white turtlehead. The first instar caterpillars in the fall, they really feel compelled. This is the plant that they must feed on. They overwinter in those leafy nests, and the caterpillars, when they emerge in the spring, once those caterpillars emerge in the spring from the leafy nest, they'll feed on pretty much anything. But this is a really great combination, the plant and the insect, to talk about what does native mean. Native is a regional phrase. We have a really big country and an even bigger continent. So just saying that something is native to North America doesn't really work. For some restoration work, they specify that genetic sources need to be within 50 miles or less. But I question if that's a good metric, and I'm going to go into that in a moment. But having said that, plant provenance is key. Provenance is where the genetics of that plant comes from. If you have a plant that is native all the way up into Canada and all the way down to Florida, and you take genetics from Florida and you try to grow them in Ontario, that plant may not live because you're taking some of the most southernly adapted genetic populations of that plant and moving it way out of its range. So let's look at this 50-mile metric, still looking at white turtleheads and Baltimore checker spots. So this is an ecoregion map. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. These are put out by the EPA, and the link is down at the lower right-hand corner of the page there. And this shows different areas that have both by virtue of soils and climate have a lot in common with each other. And I list just a few of the ecoregions for the northeastern area. where I live in northwestern New Jersey has more in common with parts of Ohio or New England than it does, really, with areas down at the Jersey Shore. 50 miles can span a bunch of different ecoregions, or hundreds of miles can stay within a single ecoregion. Ecoregion, I think here, is really key. So then how does ecoregion affect plant choice when you're looking at landscaping questions? Up in the upper right-hand corner here, this is a map from the Biota of North American program, BONAP. And it shows the distribution of Chelone glabra, white turtlehead, in the United States. The dark green shows states or provinces where the species is present. The light green shows where it's present and not rare from a county-wide point of view. And yellow shows where the species is present and rare. And you can see by overlapping that and looking at that in comparison to ecoregions, you can see which ecoregions this plant is adapted to. Now, if we then also look at a map of where the Baltimore checker spot, which relies on white turtlehead as a host plant, lives, you can see that it overlaps quite well. There are a few outliers, and there is the occasional butterfly that will go out beyond the range. But this particular insect, the Baltimore checker spot, is so closely allied with its host plant that it is rarely found more than 100 yards from its host plant. 100 yards. It's not going to stray very far looking for a host plant. So again, this is the caterpillar of the Baltimore checker spot and the overwinter and nest at the base of the plant. If we look at some other plants, we can see how the ecoregion maps and the BONAP maps can show us how to choose plants wisely in our landscapes. We can see what ecoregions herb Robert is native to, shown here in bright green and yellow. But we can also see where this plant was introduced into the West Coast. The teal colored spots show where the species is exotic and present. So it doesn't belong in Southern California or Montana, and even more so in Oregon and Washington State, where this species has now become a noxious invasive plant. Just because something's native to part of North America doesn't mean that it will behave itself when growing in other parts of North America. And we can look at ecoregions instead of jumping over 10 ecoregions from one side of the country to the other. We can look at ecoregions as guidelines on how to choose plants that might work in our area. So we have tall white beard tongue. It's used very heavily in the landscape trade. And you can see here, I've got the level 3 ecoregion map in place. You can see where it is native, and then you can see where, with the teal, where it's been introduced. But it works in that area because it's only been moved one ecoregion. It is nearby where it is native and is not causing trouble. By the way, that spot right in the middle of the background picture there, that's a hummingbird feeding on Penstemon digitalis at Duke Farms. Oops, wrong direction. Calico beard tongue. It's rather more rare, and you can see its native distribution is a little bit more west. It has also been introduced into the Northeast without any serious consequences. It's being introduced to a nearby ecoregion. Appalachian beard tongue. It's been introduced all the way up into Maine, but But again, it's sort of following the Appalachian range up. In some ways, you can look at these ecoregions as predictors for where some plants and insects may move to as our climate continues to warm. Did it again, wrong direction, sorry about that. Pale beard tongue. It's really more of a Midwest native, but it's also being used some in landscaping in the Northeast, and it has escaped into the wild from there. Very floriferous, produces tons and tons of flowers. And then the northeastern beard tongue, which is actually native to the Northeast. This is a very, very tough plant. This plant will cling to rock faces and bloom just perfectly happily. We underestimate the great diversity of plants that we have at our disposal. Shrubby St. John's wort is rarely seen in landscapes, but it's beautiful. It has a flower that's more than an inch across, and it's a host to the gray hair streak, as well as several other butterflies and moths that also all feed on St. John's worts. The St. John's worts tend to all be deer resistant. They're bitter. The deer leave them alone. Great St. John's wort, it's a huge plant. It grows to 7 feet tall with flowers that are easily 2 inches across at the top. And the little, the spotted St. John's wort, very deer resistant, does great in the meadow. All these St. John's worts are also host to the wavy lined emerald. That's actually a moth. It's a beautiful green moth, and the caterpillar is called the camouflaged looper, because what it does is, as it feeds on flowers mostly, it cuts off parts of the flowers and glues them to its back so that it is invisible to predators. And then this is the little one, the dwarf St. John's wort. Makes a really nice little ground cover, and all the foliage turns bright red in the fall. A beautiful little plant, but very, very rarely seen in landscapes. Again, the irises. If we talk about native irises with most folks, the only one that they'll be able to come up with, in the East at any rate, is Iris versicolor, blue flag iris. The irises are all supporters of hummingbirds. Most people don't think about that. Hummingbirds are actually specialists. They only feed on flowers with deep nectar. That is actually a hummingbird on my hand. I rescued it out of the shipping office one day, and it sat on my hand for several minutes before it flew away. Northern blue flag iris is a great plant. It's clay tolerant, but it's not the only tool in the toolbox we have when it comes to irises, and we forget that. We have the slender blue flag iris, which is almost as tall, but much more elegant in its, it has slender falls, it has slender leaves. Wonderful plant. And the adorable little dwarf crested iris. Can grow as a ground cover, only grows to be about 8 inches tall. The first time I saw this plant was in the Hemlock Bluffs Nature Preserve in Cary, North Carolina. It was clinging to a hillside in the woods. We need to look to our diversity and use the diversity that we have at our disposal. And by doing so, we'll support a lot of creatures, a lot of wildlife in our gardens. We know about black elderberry, but we forget about red elderberry. It really likes rocky soil. It's a woodland species. We use New England aster. How many asters can you name? We have about 40 different species of aster in the Northeast, and they support a bunch of different butterflies and moths, as well as tons of nectaring insects and pollinators. So yes, we have the New England aster, but we also have the blue wood aster, which blooms well into the end of October and it's just dripping with all kinds of pollinators. We have whitewood aster. We have crooked-stemmed aster, which I think is a terrible, terrible name for a plant, but is a beautiful aster. Smooth blue aster with blue-green foliage. All of these are host plant to the silvery checker spot, the Ecoregion flower moth, and many others. Purple-stemmed aster, which will take it very wet. It's also known as swamp aster. We spend an awful lot of time trying to take the wetlands that we find in landscapes and fill them in to make average soil, or take the acid soil and turn it into sweet soil, or turn the clay and turn it into something that's not clay. But if we choose plants that are adapted to these different habitats, we can make use of this great variety of plants and honestly make our lives a whole lot easier as well, because quite frankly, turning clay soil, adding enough amendments to clay soil to make it into anything other than clay soil is not easily done. Calico asters. And Joe Pye weeds, we get a lot of requests for Joe Pye weeds, but people don't even realize there are different types of Joe Pye weeds. So there's hollow Joe Pye weed, Eutrochium fistulosum, which can really grow quite huge. We actually have one growing at back in our production area. This year it's growing in a gap near a fence, and because it's been getting lots and lots of water, we've been very fortunate, I suppose, to have tons of water this year. It's about 8 feet tall. This can be a very big plant. But we also have spotted Joe Pye weed, which is rather shorter. Late flowering boneset, which is also a Joe Pye weed, in a manner of speaking. Very deer resistant, here with a white M hair streak, who lives on these insects need oaks for their host plant. Blue mistflower, Conoclinium celestinum, host plant to the climbing moth. Hyssop leaf boneset, this is a great boneset that no one uses. Gray-green foliage, tons of flowers, drought and salt tolerant. So I'm going to be finishing up the presentation in just a few moments here. If you have more questions to ask, now would be the time to type in your questions. But this is an eastern tiger swallowtail on hollow Joe Pye weed, one of these giant Joe Pye weeds. And these tiger swallowtails, they will feed on actually a great variety of woody host plants, a lot of trees. Tiger swallowtails are not particularly, eastern tiger swallowtails are not particularly host plant specific that way. But you'll notice I've gotten through almost the entire presentation before I showed any picture of a swallowtail at all. All butterflies are not swallowtails, nor are they monarchs. We need to embrace the diversity of insects and see how by embracing that diversity, we can really make the landscape a functioning ecosystem that can support a great deal of wildlife and honestly make the landscape a much more interesting place. Flowers are beautiful, but flowers with butterflies are even more so. To create a functioning ecosystem, we need all the parts. Our decisions on what plants to put into the landscape create the basis of the food chain. Without natives, we can't support our native wildlife. We can't support the bees, the birds, the butterflies, yes, the snakes, the gray tree frog, and the baby box turtle in the lower right-hand corner. We need a diversity of plants. We need a diversity of structure. And we need to embrace a diversity of insects to create a functioning ecosystem and use the tools at our disposal, such as the ecoregion maps, to help us understand what native plants are best suited to our area. We simply have so many plants to choose from and so many creatures that are depending upon them. Here on the last page here, I put some of the links to some of the different sites that I referenced throughout the presentation. So I put in a link here to the EPA ecoregion maps, a link to the Biota of North American program, or BONAP. The North American Butterfly Association has a lot of terrific information on host plants. The Moth Photographers Group out of Mississippi State also has a lot of great information on moths. And iNaturalist will cover all the rest of the insects. If you're interested in looking at what they might be using, what their life histories are like, and how introducing them or inviting them into your garden can really help create for a more interesting landscape. I thank everyone for coming today. I'm here for questions. I'm going to turn it back over to Penny, so perhaps I can get some of those questions answered for you folks. Are you there, Penny?
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yes, we have several questions. The first is about a nativar. Is the nativar Chelone hot lips a plant that would attract Baltimore checker spot?
No, it is not. Chelone lyonii, even the straight species, does not attract the Baltimore checker spot. It only really wants the white turtle head. And honestly, talking about some of the nativars, one of the things that is tricky in the research is just beginning on the nativars is when we create nativars, we are selecting them with our own interests at heart. We're looking for leaf color or flower color. In some cases, they found that some of the nativars will not support insects that the straight species can support. For example, some of the burgundy foliaged shrubs that have come out. I think there's cletheras that are burgundy. There's also ninebarks that have burgundy foliage. But that burgundy foliage has a bittering agent in it which actually precludes native insects from feeding on that plant and completing their development. So it's a bit tricky to use nativars in that respect if you're really trying to support wildlife. And we simply don't know how some of those nativars are interacting with our native fauna at this point.
All right, thank you. The next is about a plant combination that you showed in one of your earlier slides, Echinacea and Agastache. And the question is there some trick to getting Agastache to winter over?
It likes a little bit of a slope. It doesn't like it to be too wet. Those crowns will rot if it's too wet. So probably the best trick for that is just have it on ever so slight of a slope. It doesn't need much. But if it's in a bit of a hollow, that crown's going to rot.
Okay, good suggestion. Can you recommend any annual natives to plant between slow-growing perennials and shrubs while they get established to eliminate the need for mulch?
That's a really good question. I've mostly worked with perennials. We're starting to work with more annuals just over the last couple of years. Some of the short-lived perennials work well. The Hypericum uticum, for example, that I showed in a slide, that's a nice, it doesn't get very tall. One of the things that I tend to do in my own landscaping is I put in either short-lived perennials or species that I do not expect to be in the final landscape, certainly, to take up that space. I don't have any specific ground covers to put in there. Certainly you can put in some Rudbeckia hirta, black-eyed Sue. You can put in Rudbeckia triloba, which is a little bit shorter, and honestly I think is a little bit better looking plant. It's a short-lived perennial at best, but it will pop a fair amount of color. Also, partridge pea is a nice one, Chemacrista fasciculata. It's an annual, it'll fill in nicely, and you'll get some flowers that first year or two while you're waiting for the perennials to fill in. I would like to, and I think I'm going to have to do some of my own research to try to find sort of a nice list of some of those filler annuals to work in between the perennials in new landscapes. Great question.
Excellent. We'll wait for a webinar on that at another time. The next question is, in your plant communities, what do you recommend for things that grow well to supply nectar for butterflies and monarchs?
Oh, wow. Well, I think I beat the goldenrod to death in the presentation, so I don't need to mention the goldenrods for the fall. Moving backwards, I would say goldenrods and asters for the fall. In the middle of the summer, I would say, and late summer, I would say the agastache is really very good. The white snakeroot actually is very good. Any of the eupatoriums or the eutrochiums are very good for late summer. Going into early summer, or midsummer, the milkweeds, they love nectaring on the milkweeds. Spring is a little bit trickier, but they will feed on anything that has nectar going forward in the spring. They will go to beard tongues, which tend to flower in the early summer. Pretty much, I have seen monarchs nectaring on almost anything you can name that's flowering when they get here in late May. So looking for, I've even seen them on Palimonium, the Jacob's ladder. I've seen them attempting to nectar on violets, although I don't think that was very successful. They will, if it's got a flower, they will go to it and try to nectar on it in the spring. So the trick is making sure that you have something flowering and making sure that you continue that through the fall. Really, a lot of the ones that arrive here in May, although they have been migrating quite a ways, they mostly get up here, look for the newly emerged milkweeds, because milkweeds tend to come up very late in the spring. The leaves come up very late in the spring. They arrive, they do a little bit of nectaring. Really, their first order of business is to simply lay eggs so that they can start that process.
Okay. Are there any shrubs that you can recommend for early spring nectar?
Shrubs for early spring nectar. Well, viburnums are wonderful. I love all the viburnums. And you can have quite a variety of bloom time there, looking at the different native viburnums. The native azaleas are fabulous and horribly underused, also underpropagated in the nursery trade, I have to say, but it's, I think, partly because they're underused. The bush, the shrubby dogwoods, also underused. So, you know, we're familiar with the flowering dogwood, but we tend to forget about the gray dogwood and the red panicled dogwood, the silky dogwood. Some of the shrub dogwoods are also really nice nectar sources in the spring.
Okay. And back to the goldenrods for another question. Is there a variety of goldenrod that's low and reliable that could be used as a ground cover?
As a ground cover, I would go with wreath goldenrod, Solideo, Cassia, or Caesia, depending on which way you like to pronounce that particular epithet. The wreath goldenrod tends to arch, so it lays over some, so the stalks don't tend to stand upright, and they actually make a very nice fall ground cover. The stems tend toward purple, so you have a blue-purple stem with green leaves, and then the flowers all along the stem. And if you plant them reasonably densely together, you can get a nice ground cover out of that.
Okay, good. And another question on the Baltimore checker spot. How far north are they found?
They go up through, to the best of my recollection, they go up about midway up through Maine. I think there are some of them on the Niagara Peninsula, in Ontario, but not much further north than that. Their host plant actually grows further north than the butterflies can manage.
Excellent. All right, the next question is, do you see pollinator preferences in natives such as the white or pink turtlehead other than that one that you mentioned?
Pollinator preferences, or because that was talking about host plant preferences, I think, with the chelone.
Right.
Are we talking? So we're talking about host plant preferences. Some, but not. It's usually trying to say usually and make a generalization about all the thousands and thousands of insects that are out there is very difficult. Some insects certainly are extremely choosy about their host plant. Some insects will, over time, it's really sort of watching the nascent stages of evolution of a population. You'll see that they will start to expand their range. For example, the Baltimore checker spot really, really wants that white turtlehead. Doesn't want pink turtlehead, but there are some populations that have popped up which will now complete their entire development on English plantain. So we're not quite sure how that evolutionary quirk happened, but clearly they've expanded their range there. I find it interesting that they have expanded to English plantain, but by God, they still won't feed on pink turtlehead. And you'd think, really. There's also some subpopulations that have shown that they can complete their entire development on northeastern beard tongue, which also you wouldn't think was terribly closely related. So it depends on the insects. Most insects have some host plant preference. Some will use the next best thing, but others, like monarchs, for example, which can feed on any milkweed that you give them, but nothing else. It's interesting, and it's really very species specific.
Okay, very good. This next one's about hummingbirds. With the warming trends and hummingbirds staying later and later into the season, are there any late season nectar plants that you can recommend?
Sure, that's actually a really good question. Coral honeysuckle, also known as trumpet honeysuckle, Lonicera sempervirens, which will bloom all through the season. It's a really excellent native vine that the hummingbirds will go to all season, and it will flower well into the fall. Certainly, we have found that there's a great deal of flower time variation in the lobelias. So we can get lobelias that will flower much later than the rest. We don't separate them out and call them a cultivar or anything, but you can, if you put great lobelias, Lobelia syphilitica and Lobelia cardinalis, and get a lot of them, you can see actually quite a bit of variation in bloom time. Also, the sometimes Monarda didyma, the bee balm, the red bee balm, sometimes that will also, particularly if you cut it back, sometimes that will also bloom into the fall and provide nectar for the hummingbirds. It's a really good question. It's going to be, I'd rather not have seen global warming, quite frankly, but it will be interesting from an ecological point of view to see how different creatures adapt to the different timings of, if the insects are moving, if the birds are moving, if they're emerging at times different than their host plants, it could really wreak havoc with some populations.
Yes, definitely. And I see that we're running out of time, so we have only time for one last question here. And this is, if someone is interested in planting a lot of the natives that you recommended to attract some of the specialist pollinators, about how long would it take for the garden to develop enough to start seeing these specialists come into your yard?
Well, that's really an excellent question. I don't know who asked that question, but it's an excellent question. So here's the problem with that, is we don't know. And it depends on the specialist. So for the Baltimore checker spot, which only normally strays 100 yards or so from its host plant, if the next population of them is 3 counties away, you may wait for a very, very long time, unless there is a patchwork of Chelone glabra coming all the way from 3 counties away and leading to your garden. This is one of the problems that they discovered in prairie restoration out west. Some of the prairies that they have, tallgrass prairies that they have restored, the nearest tallgrass prairie that's been restored is 100 miles away. The insects do not necessarily recruit. Most insects are going to overwinter where they are. And they're not necessarily going to simply start flying off across the landscape like Jonathan Livingston, butterfly, hoping that there's a host plant over there in that direction. So having said that, I would probably, for some of them, you may start seeing them right away if there's a nearby population that you can recruit them from. So you may start seeing them 1-2 years in. They may show up very quickly. Other insects, it may take 5, it may take 10 years before they happen to find your planting, particularly if you're planting in an area that is more of a biological desert. If you're putting an interesting garden in, Central Park, the recruitment of insects from outside is not going to be as great as if you're putting in an interesting garden in central Pennsylvania.
Right, right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Eckel. This has been such an inspiring talk, wonderful photographs, and certainly has inspired us to get out there and do a lot more with native plants to support the pollinators. Thank you again, Dr. Eckel, and we wish you all good day and good gardening.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.